I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Brenda Whitmore standing on my front porch at 7 in the morning, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield, and her lips pressed into a thin line that could cut glass. "Marcus Vandergriff," she said, though she obviously knew who I was. We had lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, for 3 years now. "That's me," I said, keeping my voice neutral. I had just gotten back from my morning run and was still catching my breath. The cool April air felt good against my skin, but Brenda's presence had a way of making everything feel stifling. "I'm here in my official capacity as president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association," she announced, as if I might have forgotten her favorite title. "We need to discuss a serious violation of our community guidelines." My mind raced through possibilities. The lawn was pristine. The house was freshly painted last fall in an approved color. The trash cans were stored out of sight. What violation? "Your guest situation," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Multiple neighbors have reported seeing military personnel coming and going from your residence at all hours. The HOA bylaws clearly state that all long-term guests must be approved by the board, and frankly, we have concerns about the type of activity that might be occurring here." I felt my jaw tighten. "My brother is staying with me. He's a veteran. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan." "Be that as it may," Brenda said, flipping through papers on her clipboard. "Section 12. Paragraph 4 of our bylaws states that any guest staying longer than 14 consecutive days must receive written approval from the HOA board. Your brother has been here for what, 2 months now?" 6 weeks, I corrected. "And I wasn't aware I needed permission to have my own family stay with me in the house I own." Brenda's expression shifted into something that resembled sympathy but felt more like condescension. "Marcus, I understand that family is important, but rules are rules. They apply to everyone equally. Besides, several residents have expressed discomfort with the comings and goings. Military vehicles, other men in uniform visiting. It creates an atmosphere that not everyone finds appropriate for our family-oriented community." "An atmosphere," I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "My brother served our country. His friends are checking on him. What exactly is inappropriate about that?" "There's no need to get defensive," Brenda said, holding up one hand. "I'm simply here to inform you that the board met yesterday evening, and we've voted to require your guest to vacate the premises within 72 hours. If he doesn't comply, we'll be forced to impose fines of $500 per day until the violation is corrected." My heart pounded in my chest. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. You'll receive official notice in the mail, but I wanted to deliver the news personally as a courtesy." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Marcus, the board also wants to remind you that we've noticed your garage door has been left open past the 8 p.m. cutoff time on multiple occasions. Please see that it doesn't happen again." She walked back down the driveway to her white Lexus SUV, leaving me standing there feeling like I had just been sucker punched. I went inside and found my brother Max sitting at the kitchen table, working on his laptop. He was 31, 3 years younger than me, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of lean, muscled build that came from years of military discipline. But his eyes held shadows that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Who was that?" he asked without looking up. "HOA president. She says you have to leave in 3 days or they'll start fining me $500 a day." Max's fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. He looked up at me, his expression carefully neutral. "I can go. I don't want to cause you problems." "Absolutely not," I said, surprised by the force in my own voice. "This is my house. You're my brother. You're staying as long as you need to." "Marcus, I appreciate what you're doing, but maybe it's time anyway. I've been here too long already." "You haven't been here long enough," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "You just started seeing that therapist last month. You're finally sleeping more than 3 hours a night. I'm not letting some power-hungry HOA president with nothing better to do mess that up." Max had come to stay with me after his marriage fell apart. The details were complicated and painful, involving PTSD that neither he nor his ex-wife had fully understood how to handle. The divorce had been finalized just before he showed up on my doorstep with 2 duffel bags and a haunted look in his eyes. He had been doing better lately, slowly finding his footing again. The last thing he needed was to feel like a burden. "What are you going to do?" Max asked. "I'm going to fight this," I said. "Let me make some calls." I started with my real estate attorney, Gerald Hoffman, who had handled my home purchase. He listened patiently while I explained the situation, then sighed heavily. "The problem is that HOA bylaws are legally binding contracts," he said. "When you bought the house, you agreed to abide by them. If the bylaws say long-term guests need approval, they can enforce that. Even for family members. Even for someone who served in the military. The law doesn't generally make exceptions based on relationship or military service when it comes to contractual obligations," Gerald said. "However, there might be an angle here. Tell me more about your brother's situation. You mentioned he has PTSD." "Yes, he's in treatment for it." "Does he have a service dog or any other assistance animal?" I frowned. "No, why? Because if he did, that would bring disability and fair housing laws into play. But without that, I'm not sure what leverage you have. Let me do some research and get back to you." After we hung up, I felt frustration building in my chest. There had to be something I could do. I spent the rest of the morning searching online, reading through North Carolina housing laws, federal regulations, anything that might give me ammunition against the HOA. That afternoon, Max's friend Derek stopped by. Derek was a sergeant in the Army, still active duty, and he had served with Max in Afghanistan. He was a big guy with an easy smile, the kind of person who made you feel comfortable immediately. He and Max were planning to go to a veteran support group meeting together. Derek's truck was parked in the driveway when Brenda drove by slowly. Her head turned toward my house in what she probably thought was a subtle observation. I watched from the window as she circled the block and drove by again. "She's really got a problem with military people, doesn't she?" Max said, coming to stand beside me. "Apparently so." "You know what's funny?" Max said quietly. "People thank us for our service all the time. They wave flags on the 4th of July and Memorial Day. But when we actually need support, when we're dealing with the aftermath of what we saw and did over there, suddenly we're an inconvenience. Suddenly we make people uncomfortable." His words hit me hard because they were true. I had seen it before, the disconnect between patriotic rhetoric and actual support for veterans. But I had never expected to see it play out in my own HOA. That evening, I got the official notice in my mailbox. It was printed on HOA letterhead and signed by Brenda and 2 other board members. The language was formal and threatening, citing specific bylaw violations and outlining the fine structure. There was also a highlighted section stating that failure to comply could result in a lien being placed on my property. I photographed the letter and sent it to Gerald. He called me back within an hour. "This is aggressive," he said. "Usually HOAs start with warnings and escalate gradually. Going straight to a 72-hour eviction notice with $500 daily fines suggests they really want your brother gone." "Has there been any other conflict with the board?" "Not that I know of. I've always paid my dues on time. I follow the rules." Then this might be personal, or it might be that someone on the board has a problem with military personnel specifically. Either way, we might be able to challenge the enforcement as discriminatory or disproportionate. But Marcus, I have to be honest with you. Fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming, and the outcome is never guaranteed. You might spend thousands in legal fees and still lose. So what do I do? You could request a hearing before the board. Present your case. Ask for an exception. Try to resolve it without lawyers getting involved. I didn't have much faith that Brenda would be reasonable, but I decided to try. I called the number listed on the HOA website and left a message requesting an emergency hearing. To my surprise, Brenda called me back within an hour. "Marcus," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I got your message. The board can meet with you tomorrow evening at 7. We'll hold it at the community center." "Thank you," I said, trying to match her tone. "I appreciate you accommodating this so quickly. Of course, we always want to hear from our residents, though I should warn you that the board's decision is unlikely to change. The bylaws are quite clear." The next day, I prepared for the hearing like I was preparing for a trial. I printed out copies of Max's military service records, his honorable discharge papers, letters from his therapist about his treatment plan, and documentation of his divorce proceedings showing that this was a temporary living situation while he got back on his feet. I also researched HOA law and found several cases where courts had sided with homeowners who were penalized too harshly for minor infractions. Max offered to come with me, but I told him to stay home. I didn't want the board to grill him directly or use his condition against us. The Meadowbrook Heights Community Center was a bland brick building near the neighborhood entrance. I arrived 10 minutes early and found Brenda already there, along with 2 other board members. One was a thin, severe-looking man in his 50s named Harold Pritchard, and the other was a woman about Brenda's age named Susan Kellerman. Susan at least offered me a polite smile when I walked in. "Thank you for meeting with me," I said, taking a seat across the table from them. "Let's make this quick," Harold said, checking his watch. "I have a conference call at 8. Brenda folded her hands on the table. "Marcus, you requested this hearing to discuss the guest violation at your property. The floor is yours." I took a breath and launched into my prepared remarks. I explained Max's service record, the challenges he was facing, the fact that this was clearly a temporary situation and not some permanent arrangement. I emphasized that he was family, that he was quiet and respectful, that there had been no actual disturbance to the neighborhood. The bylaws require approval for long-term guests to prevent situations where properties become overcrowded or used as rental units without proper vetting, I said. But that's clearly not what's happening here. My brother is recovering from both a divorce and service-related PTSD. He needs family support right now. Kicking him out would be cruel and, frankly, I think it would reflect poorly on this community. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Susan looked sympathetic, but Harold and Brenda exchanged a glance that told me I was wasting my time. "We appreciate you sharing that information," Brenda said in a tone that suggested she didn't appreciate it at all. "But the personal circumstances of your guest, while unfortunate, don't negate the bylaws that all residents agreed to follow. If we make an exception for you, we'd have to make exceptions for everyone. The rules would become meaningless." "Have you ever enforced this rule before?" I asked. "Because I know plenty of people in this neighborhood who have had parents or adult children stay with them for extended periods." Harold cleared his throat. "Those situations were brought to the board's attention and approved on a case-by-case basis." "Then why can't you approve this situation?" Because those situations didn't involve multiple military personnel creating a disturbance in the neighborhood, Brenda said, her mask of politeness finally slipping. We've had complaints, Marcus. Residents are concerned about strange men in uniform coming and going at odd hours. One neighbor reported hearing what sounded like shouting late at night. Another said they saw someone outside your house at 3 in the morning. These are legitimate safety concerns. I felt anger rising in my chest. My brother has friends from his unit who check on him. They're not strange men, they're veterans. And yes, sometimes Max has nightmares and I go out to talk with him because he can't sleep. That's part of PTSD. None of this is a safety concern. You're making it sound sinister when it's just a man trying to heal from serving his country. Your defensiveness isn't helping your case, Harold said sharply. I'm not being defensive, I'm being honest. And I think you need to examine why you're treating veterans like they're criminals. Brenda's face flushed red. How dare you suggest we're discriminating against military personnel? I have a yellow ribbon magnet on my car. I support the troops completely. But supporting the troops doesn't mean I have to accept rule violations in my neighborhood. Your neighborhood, I said. I own my house. I pay my HOA dues. It's my neighborhood too. Susan held up her hands. Everyone, let's take a breath. Marcus, I understand your frustration, and I personally think your brother's service should be acknowledged and appreciated, but Brenda has a point about the bylaws. Maybe there's a compromise here. What if you submitted a formal request for approval, and your brother agreed to a specific end date for his stay? That way we're following proper procedure, and you get more time to help him transition to permanent housing. It wasn't a great solution, but it was something. I looked at Brenda and Harold, trying to gauge their reactions. How long of an extension are we talking about? Harold asked Susan. Maybe 90 days. That gives him time to find a place and make arrangements. Brenda shook her head. Absolutely not. 90 days is too long. If we're going to allow this at all, which I'm not convinced we should, it would be 30 days maximum. 30 days isn't enough time, I said. He needs stability right now. Moving too quickly could set back his recovery. Then perhaps he should have thought about that before overstaying his welcome, Brenda said coldly. I stared at her, suddenly understanding that this wasn't really about bylaws or rules or neighborhood safety. This was about power and control. Brenda enjoyed wielding authority over people, and she especially enjoyed it when they pushed back because it gave her an excuse to dig in harder. I'll accept the 90-day extension, I said, looking at Susan. If the board approves it. We need to vote, Susan said, glancing at the others. Harold sighed. I'll agree to 60 days, not 90, that's my compromise. 60 days is acceptable, I said quickly before Brenda could object. I vote no, Brenda said immediately. This sets a terrible precedent. I vote yes, Susan said. 60 days, with a written agreement that the guest will vacate by that date. Harold was the tiebreaker. He looked uncomfortable, clearly not wanting to cross Brenda but also not wanting to appear heartless. Fine, 60 days. But Marcus, if your brother is still there on day 61, the fines start immediately. 500 per day, no exceptions, no further hearings. Understood, I said, relief flooding through me. It wasn't perfect, but it gave us time. Brenda looked furious, but she was outvoted. This meeting is adjourned, she said sharply, gathering her papers and standing up so quickly her chair scraped across the floor. I drove home feeling like I had won a battle but not the war. When I told Max about the 60-day extension, he seemed more troubled than relieved. I'll be gone before that, he said. I don't want you dealing with more harassment because of me. You're dealing with enough already. Let me handle the HOA. Over the next 2 weeks, things seemed to calm down. I got the written agreement from the HOA outlining the terms of Max's stay, and I signed it without complaint. Max continued his therapy sessions and started looking at apartments, though I could tell he wasn't really ready to live alone yet. His nightmares had decreased but hadn't stopped, and he still had days where the depression hit him so hard he could barely get out of bed. Derek and a few other guys from Max's unit continued to visit regularly. They had formed a tight bond overseas, the kind that didn't break just because they were back stateside. I was grateful for their presence because I could see how much it helped Max to be around people who understood what he had been through. Then Brenda started escalating again. It started with a violation notice about my trash cans being visible from the street 15 minutes before the designated time. Then another notice about a small patch of weeds in my flower bed. Then a complaint that my house numbers weren't properly illuminated at night, even though they were lit by the same fixture that had been there since I bought the place. I realized she was building a case against me, documenting every tiny infraction so she could paint me as a problem resident. It was petty and transparent, but it was also effective because each violation came with a small fine, and those fines were starting to add up. When I got a notice saying I needed to repaint my front door because the color had faded beyond acceptable standards, I decided to push back. I took photographs of my door and doors of identical color on 3 other houses in the neighborhood, then submitted them to the board with a formal complaint about selective enforcement. Brenda responded by showing up at my house unannounced with a color swatch, claiming my door was half a shade off the approved palette. The whole thing was absurd, but I paid a handyman to repaint the door anyway because I didn't want to give her any ammunition. The harassment might have continued at that low simmer if not for what happened one Tuesday evening in early May. Max and Derek had gone to the VA hospital in Charlotte for a group therapy session. They got back around 9, and Derek walked Max to the door as he usually did. I was in the living room watching television when I heard shouting outside. I rushed to the front door and found Brenda standing in my driveway, her phone held up like she was recording. Derek stood between her and the house, his posture defensive. "What's going on?" I demanded. "This man was skulking around your property," Brenda said, her voice shrill. "I saw him from my house and came to investigate. He won't identify himself. He's my brother's friend. He's been here dozens of times. You know who he is." "I know there's been a lot of suspicious activity at this address," Brenda shot back, "and I have every right to question people who are behaving suspiciously in our neighborhood." Derek's jaw was clenched tight. "Madam, I'm just walking my friend to his door. There's nothing suspicious about it." "You're in military uniform in a civilian neighborhood at night. That's inherently suspicious." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Derek is active duty Army. He comes here straight from base. There is nothing suspicious about a soldier visiting his friend." "I'm calling the police," Brenda announced. "Let them sort it out." "Are you serious right now?" I said, my voice rising. "You're going to waste police time because a veteran in uniform walked someone to their door. If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be worried about the police coming." She made the call right there in my driveway. I apologized to Derek, who looked more tired than angry. Max stood in the doorway, his face pale, and I could see him retreating into himself the way he did when things got too intense. 2 Charlotte Mecklenburg police officers arrived about 15 minutes later. They looked confused when they surveyed the scene. Me, Derek, and Max standing calmly in the driveway, Brenda pacing and gesturing dramatically. The older of the 2 officers, whose nameplate read Martinez, approached me. "We got a call about suspicious persons. Want to tell me what's going on?" I explained the situation as clearly and calmly as I could. Derek provided his military ID without being asked. Max showed his ID as well and explained he lived at the residence. Officer Martinez turned to Brenda. "Madam, these gentlemen all have legitimate reasons to be here. I'm not sure what you want us to do." "I want them to stop conducting military activities in a residential neighborhood," Brenda said. "We have children here. People are frightened." "Military activities," Martinez repeated. "They're just visiting. That's not illegal." "There are multiple violations of HOA bylaws occurring at this property. This is a documented pattern." The younger officer, whose name was Chen, spoke up. "HOA violations are a civil matter, madam. They're not police business unless there's an actual crime being committed." "So you're not going to do anything?" Brenda's voice got higher. "You're going to let them continue terrorizing this neighborhood?" "Nobody is terrorizing anyone," Martinez said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I suggest you take your concerns to your HOA board and leave these gentlemen alone." "Officers, if you want to file a complaint about harassment, you have that right." Brenda looked shocked. "Harassment? I'm trying to protect my community." "By calling the police on veterans for visiting their friend." "Madam, I'm a veteran myself. I can tell you right now, if you keep making these kinds of calls, you're going to find yourself in legal trouble for false reports." Brenda sputtered something incoherent, then turned and marched back to her house. The officers checked in with us one more time, making sure we were okay, then left with apologetic nods. Derek left shortly after, but the damage was done. Max disappeared into his room and didn't come out for the rest of the night. When I checked on him the next morning, he was packing his duffel bags. "I'm leaving today," he said flatly. "This has gone too far. I'm not going to let that woman destroy your life because of me." "Max, stop. You have 6 more weeks on the agreement." "I don't care about the agreement. She called the cops on Derek. She's making everyone's life miserable. I need to go." I grabbed his arm. "Listen to me. If you leave now, Brenda wins. She gets exactly what she wants. Is that really what you want, to let someone like her push you around?" Max's eyes were red-rimmed. "I'm tired of fighting, Marcus. I fought over there for years. I fought to save my marriage. I fought to stay sane after I got back. I don't have any fight left in me." My heart broke looking at him. "Then let me fight for you, please. Just give me a little more time to figure this out." He hesitated, then slowly started unpacking. 1 week. If you can't fix this in 1 week, I'm gone. I mean it." I agreed, even though I had no idea how I was going to fix anything in 7 days. I called Gerald again and told him about the police incident. He listened carefully, asking detailed questions about what Brenda had said and how the officers had responded. "This is good," he said when I finished. "How is any of this good?" "Because she's crossed a line from enforcing HOA rules into what could be considered harassment and discrimination. Calling the police on someone specifically because they're in military uniform, claiming military personnel are terrorizing the neighborhood. That's not legitimate HOA business. That's targeting a specific group of people. So, what do we do? Let me ask you something. Does your brother have an official PTSD diagnosis?" "Yes, from the VA." "Is he receiving disability benefits?" "He is." "Then he qualifies as an individual with a disability under federal law. And here's where this gets interesting, Marcus. Your brother isn't just a guest. He's someone with a documented disability who requires assistance and accommodation. The Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act both have provisions that protect people with disabilities from discrimination." I felt a spark of hope. "Keep going." "If your brother needs to live with you as part of his recovery and treatment plan, that could be considered a reasonable accommodation under the law. The HOA can't refuse reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities." They're required to make exceptions to their rules if those exceptions are necessary for someone with a disability to enjoy their housing. But Max doesn't have a service dog or anything like that. You said before that wouldn't work. I was thinking too narrowly, Gerald admitted. We don't need a service animal. We need documentation from his healthcare provider stating that living with family support is a medical necessity for his condition. Can you get that? I can try. I called Max's therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, and explained the situation. She was outraged when she heard what the HOA was doing. Kicking him out right now would be devastating, she said. Max has made significant progress, but he's still very fragile. The stability of living with you has been crucial to his recovery. Forcing him into an unstable housing situation could trigger a serious setback. Would you be willing to put that in writing? Absolutely. I'll draft a letter today explaining that continued residence with his brother is medically necessary for Max's treatment plan. This is exactly the kind of thing the Fair Housing Act was designed to protect. The letter arrived 2 days later via email. It was thorough and professional, outlining Max's diagnosis, his treatment progress, and the specific medical reasons why living with family support was necessary for his continued recovery. Dr. Chen explicitly stated that removing this support system prematurely posed significant risks to his mental health. Gerald reviewed the letter and sent me a formal request for reasonable accommodation to submit to the HOA. The request cited the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, included Dr. Chen's letter, and demanded that the HOA immediately cease enforcement actions related to Max's residence and provide written confirmation that he could remain as long as medically necessary. I hand-delivered the request to Brenda's house that evening. She answered the door in a bathrobe, her hair in curlers, looking irritated. "What now?" she snapped. "Formal request for reasonable accommodation under federal disability law," I said, handing her the envelope. "You and the board need to respond in writing within 10 business days." She took the envelope like it might explode. "What are you talking about? It's all explained in there. I suggest you read it carefully and consult with an attorney before responding. Federal housing discrimination is serious business." I walked away before she could reply, feeling better than I had in weeks. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I knew Brenda was planning something, but I didn't know what. The response came 8 days later, and it wasn't what I expected. Instead of a letter from Brenda, I received a certified letter from a law firm representing the HOA. The letter acknowledged receipt of my accommodation request and stated that the board was taking the matter seriously. However, it also alleged that I had made threatening statements toward board members and created a hostile environment in the community. The letter claimed that regardless of any disability accommodations, the HOA had the right to maintain peace and safety in the neighborhood, and my pattern of aggressive behavior was grounds for additional enforcement actions. It demanded that I attend a mandatory mediation session or face immediate legal action. I was stunned. Threatening statements, aggressive behavior. I had been nothing but civil, even when Brenda was at her worst. Gerald was less surprised. This is a common tactic. They're trying to shift the narrative and make you the bad guy. They know they're on shaky ground with the disability discrimination angle, so they're creating a separate justification for going after you. Can they do that? They can try, but we have documentation of everything that's happened. The police report from when Brenda called the cops supports your version of events. The officers noted that you and your guests were calm and cooperative. We can fight this. The mediation was scheduled for 2 weeks later at a law office in downtown Charlotte. Gerald advised me to bring Max so the mediator could see firsthand that he was just a regular person, not some kind of threat. The day of the mediation, Max was nervous. He put on khakis and a button-down shirt, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. I hated that he felt like he had to prove he wasn't dangerous just because he had served his country. The mediator was a pleasant woman named Jennifer Wallace, who specialized in HOA disputes. She explained that her role was to help both parties find common ground and avoid expensive litigation. Brenda showed up with Harold and an attorney, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s named Robert Kemp. Susan wasn't there, which I took as a bad sign. We sat around a conference table, and Jennifer asked each side to present their perspective. Kemp went first, laying out the HOA's position. He claimed the board had legitimate concerns about guest policies and community safety, and that I had responded to reasonable enforcement actions with hostility and legal threats. My client simply wants compliance with the rules that all residents agreed to follow, Kemp said smoothly. Instead of working cooperatively with the board, Mr. Vandergriff has chosen confrontation and has attempted to use his brother's medical condition as a shield against accountability. When it was our turn, Gerald presented our case methodically. He walked through the timeline of events, highlighted the selective enforcement, and emphasized the protective nature of federal disability law. He introduced Max, letting him speak briefly about his service and his struggles since returning home. Max's voice was quiet but steady. "I never wanted to cause problems for my brother. I just needed a safe place to recover while I got my life back together. I don't understand why that's such a threat to anyone." Brenda couldn't help herself. "It's not about you personally," she said, her tone suggesting it absolutely was about him personally. "It's about maintaining standards in our community. If everyone just did whatever they wanted, the neighborhood would fall apart. Standards like harassing veterans," Gerald said mildly. "Calling the police on someone for being in military uniform. That's an interesting standard." Kemp held up a hand. "Let's not turn this into theater. My clients have a right to enforce their bylaws. Not when those bylaws are applied in a discriminatory manner," Gerald countered. "And certainly not when enforcement violates federal disability protections." Jennifer intervened, suggesting we take separate caucuses so she could speak with each party privately. She started with Brenda's side, and Gerald, Max, and I waited in another conference room. "How do you think it's going?" I asked Gerald. "Hard to say. Mediations are unpredictable, but I think we're in a stronger position legally. The question is whether they'll recognize that or dig in." Jennifer came back after 30 minutes and spoke with us. "The HOA is willing to drop the immediate eviction demand, and the fines if you'll agree to a firm deadline of 6 months for your brother to find alternative housing. They're also asking for an apology for what they characterize as hostile interactions." "An apology?" I said incredulously. "For what? It's posturing," Gerald said. "They want to save face. Jennifer, what happens if we reject this offer?" "Then we're likely headed to court. They'll file for enforcement of the bylaws and you'll countersue for discrimination and harassment. It could take a year or more to resolve, cost both sides tens of thousands in legal fees, and the outcome is uncertain." I looked at Max. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a long moment. 6 months is reasonable. I should be able to find a place by then. If it ends this, maybe it's worth it." "But they want me to apologize," I said. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Then don't apologize for doing something wrong," Gerald suggested. "Apologize for the conflict itself. Say something like you regret that the situation escalated and you hope to move forward constructively. It's not admitting fault, it's just expressing a desire for resolution." I hated it, but I could see the logic. Fighting this in court would be expensive, stressful, and uncertain, and ultimately 6 months was enough time for Max to stabilize and transition to his own place. "Fine," I said. "I'll agree to their terms." We went back into the main conference room, and Jennifer drafted an agreement. The HOA would withdraw all pending fines and enforcement actions. Max would be allowed to stay for up to 6 months as a reasonable accommodation under disability law. I would provide a written statement expressing regret for the conflict and commitment to following community guidelines going forward. Both parties would refrain from any further harassment or hostile communications. I signed the agreement feeling like I was swallowing glass. Brenda signed with a small, satisfied smile that made me want to tear the paper in half. We left the law office in silence. In the parking garage, Max turned to me. "Thank you," he said. "I know that sucked, but thank you for fighting for me." "You're my brother," I said simply. That's what family does. Over the next few months, the tension in Meadowbrook Heights gradually decreased. Brenda and I avoided each other as much as possible. When we did cross paths, we exchanged terse nods and nothing more. The parade of violation notices stopped, and I was meticulous about following every single HOA rule to the letter. Max continued his therapy and started looking for apartments in earnest. He found a place in a quiet complex about 20 minutes away and signed a lease to start in September. He seemed more confident, more like the brother I remembered from before he deployed. Derek and the other guys still came by regularly, and Brenda seemed to have finally accepted that she couldn't do anything about it. Or maybe she realized that pushing the issue further would just expose her to more legal liability. Things might have ended there, with an uneasy peace holding until Max moved out. But in early July, something happened that changed everything. A new family moved into the neighborhood, into the house directly next to Brenda's. The family consisted of a young couple, Emma Stevens and her husband Jake, along with Emma's father who was moving in with them. The father, Richard Stevens, was a 68-year-old Marine Corps veteran who walked with a cane due to injuries from Vietnam. Within a week of them moving in, Brenda filed a complaint with the HOA board. Richard Stevens, she claimed, was a long-term guest who hadn't been approved by the board, and his presence violated the same bylaws she had tried to use against Max. Emma called me after receiving the violation notice. We had met briefly when they moved in, and I had mentioned my own issues with the HOA in passing. "I don't understand," Emma said, her voice shaking. "My father owns part of the house. He's on the deed. He's not a guest, he's a co-owner." But Brenda is saying it doesn't matter, that any resident over the age of 18 who isn't the primary purchaser needs board approval. "That can't be right," I said. "Let me call my attorney." Gerald confirmed that Brenda was completely wrong. Co-owners of a property have every right to live there. The HOA can't require approval for someone who's literally on the deed. This is either a gross misunderstanding of the bylaws or a deliberate attempt to harass this family. Based on everything with Max, I'm betting on harassment. I told Emma what Gerald had said, and she thanked me tearfully. But the situation escalated quickly from there. Brenda began targeting the Stevens family the same way she had targeted me. Violation notices for minor infractions, complaints about their landscaping, citations for their trash cans being visible at the wrong times. The breaking point came when Richard Stevens had a medical emergency. He collapsed in his front yard one afternoon, and Jake called 911. The ambulance arrived quickly, and the paramedics were loading Richard onto a stretcher when Brenda came storming across her lawn. "You can't park that ambulance here," she shouted at the paramedics. "This is a fire lane." One of the paramedics, A woman who looked like she had seen everything gave Brenda a withering look. "Madam, we're responding to a medical emergency. Please step back. I'm the HOA president, and I'm telling you this is a violation." Jake Stevens lost his temper. "My father-in-law is having a heart attack, and you're worried about where the ambulance is parked. What is wrong with you? There are rules for a reason," Brenda insisted. "Emergency vehicles are supposed to park on the street, not in driveways." The paramedic who had spoken before had clearly had enough. "Madam, if you don't step back right now, I'm calling the police to have you removed for interfering with emergency medical services." Brenda finally backed off, but the damage was done. Several neighbors had witnessed the entire exchange, and word spread quickly through the community. People who had previously stayed silent about Brenda's behavior started speaking up. I got a call from Susan Kellerman, the board member who had supported me during my hearing. "Marcus, we need to talk. A group of homeowners is calling for an emergency meeting about Brenda's conduct. After what happened with the Stevens family, people are finally seeing what she's really like. Would you be willing to speak at the meeting?" "Absolutely," I said. The emergency meeting was held at the community center on a Saturday afternoon, and the turnout was huge. The room was packed with residents, many of whom I had never seen at an HOA meeting before. Brenda sat at the front table with Harold, looking defensive and angry. Susan, acting as moderator, explained that the meeting had been called to discuss concerns about board leadership and enforcement practices. She opened the floor for comments. The first person to speak was Jake Stevens. He described the ambulance incident in detail, his voice tight with anger. "My father-in-law served in Vietnam. He earned a Purple Heart, and when he was literally dying in our front yard, your HOA president harassed the paramedics trying to save his life. Is that really the kind of community leadership we want?" Richard had survived the heart attack and was recovering in the hospital. But the incident had left the entire Stevens family shaken and furious. Emma spoke next, outlining the harassment they had experienced since moving in. She presented the violation notices, highlighted the similarities to what I had gone through, and pointed out that both cases involved military veterans. "This isn't about enforcing rules," Emma said. "This is about targeting a specific group of people. My father isn't the problem. Brenda's prejudice is the problem." When Emma sat down, I stood up. I talked about my experience with Max, the escalating harassment, the police incident, and the mediation. I explained how we had to invoke federal disability law just to get the HOA to back off. "I moved to Meadowbrook Heights because I thought it was a good community," I said. "And I still believe most people here are good people. But we have a leader who abuses her authority, who targets veterans for no reason other than her own bias, and who values her own power over the well-being of residents. That needs to change." Other residents began sharing their own stories. A woman whose elderly mother had stayed with her during cancer treatment and received violation notices. A man who had been fined for parking his work truck in his own driveway overnight. A couple who had been cited for having decorative lights up 2 days past the HOA's arbitrary deadline. The common thread was that Brenda enforced rules selectively and punitively, often targeting people who had dared to question her authority. Harold Pritchard, who had mostly stayed silent, finally spoke up. "I think we've heard enough. I move that we hold a vote of no confidence in Brenda Whitmore as HOA president." "You can't do that," Brenda said, her face pale. "I was elected by the membership, and the membership can remove you," Susan said. "That's in our bylaws, Section 28, Paragraph 2. A 2/3 vote of present homeowners can remove any board member for cause." "This is a witch hunt," Brenda protested. "I've done nothing wrong. I've followed the bylaws to the letter." "Following the bylaws and leading fairly are two different things," Susan said. "Let's take the vote." The count wasn't even close. Out of 63 homeowners present, 51 voted to remove Brenda from the board. She sat there in stunned silence as Susan announced the results, then stood up abruptly. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You want to let this neighborhood fall apart? You go right ahead. Don't come crying to me when property values tank because no one is enforcing standards." She grabbed her bag and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The meeting continued with a discussion about next steps. Susan agreed to serve as interim president, and they scheduled a special election for a permanent replacement in 30 days. Several residents volunteered to form a committee to review all the bylaws and enforcement policies to ensure they were being applied fairly. As the meeting broke up, Jake and Emma Stevens came over to thank me. "We never would have spoken up if you hadn't gone first," Emma said. "Thank you for being brave enough to fight back." "I just wanted my brother to have a safe place to stay," I said. "I didn't set out to start a revolution." "Sometimes revolutions start that way," Jake said, shaking my hand. I went home feeling lighter than I had in months. Max was in the living room watching a baseball game, and I told him what had happened. "So Brenda's gone?" he asked. "Voted out by the homeowners. It's over." Max was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, when I first got here, I felt like such a burden. Like I was this broken thing that everyone had to tiptoe around. But watching you fight for me, seeing how you refused to back down even when it would have been easier to just let me leave, it reminded me that I'm worth fighting for. That helped me more than any therapy session." I felt my throat tighten. "You've never been a burden, Max. Not for 1 second." "I know that now," he said. "Thanks to you." The next few weeks were remarkably peaceful. Susan ran the board with a completely different philosophy than Brenda, focusing on actual community building rather than enforcement and punishment. The harassment stopped. The petty violation notices disappeared. Life in Meadowbrook Heights became what it was supposed to be. Neighbors living their lives without constant scrutiny and interference. Richard Stevens recovered from his heart attack and came home from the hospital. The neighborhood organized a welcome home party for him, and dozens of people showed up with food and well wishes. It felt like the community was healing from years of Brenda's toxic leadership. Max's 6-month deadline approached, but he was ready. He had found a good apartment, established a solid routine with his therapy, and reconnected with more of his army buddies. He seemed stable and hopeful in a way he hadn't been when he first showed up at my door. We spent his last weekend at my house packing up his things and reminiscing about growing up together. It was bittersweet. I was proud of how far he had come, but I would miss having him around. "You're going to be okay," I told him as we loaded the last box into his truck. "Yeah," he agreed. I actually believe that now. Derek and a couple other guys came over to help Max move into his new place. It was a nice 2-bedroom apartment with a small balcony, and Max had already started making it his own. He hung photos from his time in service alongside pictures of our family. It was a healthy balance, honoring his past without being trapped by it. After we finished unloading, we ordered pizza and sat around talking. The conversation drifted to what had happened with the HOA, and Derek brought up something I hadn't considered. "You know, what you did was bigger than just helping Max, right?" he said. "You stood up to someone who was using power to hurt veterans. That matters. There are HOAs all over the country pulling the same garbage, and most people don't fight back. You did." "I just did what anyone would do for family," I said. "No," Max said firmly. "Most people would have told me to leave rather than risk the hassle. You didn't. You fought, even when it cost you time and money and stress. That's not nothing." I appreciated their words, but honestly, I had never thought of myself as particularly brave. I had just refused to accept an injustice, and I had been lucky enough to have resources and support to fight it. Still, as I drove home that evening, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Max was safe. The HOA had changed for the better. And maybe, just maybe, other people who heard the story would be inspired to stand up to petty tyrants in their own communities. About a month after Max moved out, I got an unexpected visitor. It was a lawyer named Patricia Mendez, who specialized in fair housing cases. She had heard about what happened in Meadowbrook Heights and wanted to talk to me about a case she was working on. I represent a family in Raleigh who's dealing with an almost identical situation, she explained over coffee at my kitchen table. Veteran with PTSD, HOA trying to kick him out, selective enforcement of guest policies. The HOA is claiming they're just following rules, but it's clearly targeted harassment. Your case is one of the few where the homeowner actually won. I was hoping you could talk me through your strategy. I spent an hour walking her through everything that had happened, emphasizing the importance of documenting everything and invoking federal disability protections early in the process. The key was having medical documentation that my brother needed to be there, I said. Once we could prove it was a medical necessity, the HOA had no choice but to accommodate. They couldn't hide behind their bylaws anymore. Patricia took detailed notes and thanked me profusely. This is incredibly helpful. I think we can use a similar approach for my clients. What happens if they still refuse? I asked. Then we file a federal lawsuit for housing discrimination. That's the nuclear option because it can result in massive penalties for the HOA, including compensatory damages, punitive damages, and attorney fees. Most HOAs back down when they realize how serious the consequences can be. She left me her card and told me to call if I ever needed anything. As I closed the door behind her, I realized that what had started as a personal fight to help my brother had turned into something bigger. We had created a roadmap that other people could follow. Over the following months, I heard from several other homeowners around North Carolina and beyond who were dealing with similar issues. Some had read about what happened in Meadowbrook Heights through local news coverage. Others had been referred to me by attorneys or veterans advocacy groups. I tried to help however I could, sharing documents, explaining strategies, and offering encouragement. It struck me how common this problem was. HOAs across the country were using their authority to discriminate against veterans, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable groups. Most people didn't fight back because they didn't know they could, or because they couldn't afford the legal costs, or because they were already dealing with so much that one more battle felt impossible. I started thinking about ways to address the issue more systematically. I reached out to a few veterans' rights organizations and proposed creating an information guide specifically about HOAs and disability accommodations. The response was enthusiastic, and we assembled a team of lawyers, advocates, and veterans to put together a comprehensive resource. The guide covered everything from understanding HOA bylaws to invoking fair housing protections to finding legal assistance. We made it available for free online, and within weeks, it had been downloaded thousands of times. I got emails from people thanking me, telling me it had made a difference in their situations. Max became involved in the project too, sharing his perspective and helping to ensure the information was practical and accessible. It gave him a sense of purpose, a way to turn his difficult experience into something positive. One evening about a year after the whole situation began, Max and I met for dinner at a restaurant in Charlotte. We had fallen into a rhythm of getting together every week or two, and it was nice to have that regular connection. "Remember when you first showed up at my door?" I said as we waited for our food. "You looked like you were barely holding it together." Max nodded. "I remember." I felt like my life was over, like I had nothing left. "And now," he smiled, "now I've got my own place, a job I don't hate, a therapy routine that actually works, and a brother who went to war with an HOA for me. I'd say things are pretty good." "You did most of the work," I pointed out. "I just made sure you had a safe place to do it." "That's what I needed most," Max said. "Safety, stability, someone who believed I was worth the trouble. Brenda and that HOA tried to take that away, but you wouldn't let them." We clinked our beer bottles together in a quiet toast. The conversation turned to other topics: Max's job at a logistics company, my own work in IT consulting, plans for the upcoming holidays. Normal stuff. Family stuff. It felt good. As we were leaving the restaurant, Max said something that stuck with me. "You know what the weirdest part of all this is? Brenda probably still thinks she was in the right. She probably tells people she was just trying to maintain standards and got attacked by an angry homeowner. She'll never understand that she was the problem." "Probably not," I agreed. "But she's not in charge anymore. That's what matters." "Yeah," Max said, "but there are other Brendas out there, running other HOAs, making other people miserable. What happens to them?" It was a good question. The problem wasn't just one petty tyrant in one neighborhood. It was a system that gave people like Brenda power without adequate accountability. That conversation planted a seed that eventually grew into something bigger. Max and I, along with several other homeowners who had dealt with HOA abuse, formed a nonprofit organization focused on HOA reform and accountability. We called it the Homeowners' Rights Coalition, and our mission was to educate people about their rights, support those fighting unjust HOA actions, and advocate for legislative changes to prevent abuse. It started small: a website, some informational materials, a handful of volunteers. But it grew quickly because the need was so great. We heard from people all over the country dealing with everything from discrimination to financial exploitation to outright corruption within their HOAs. We connected people with attorneys, helped them navigate complex regulations, and in some cases, supported them through litigation. We also worked with state legislators to propose reforms like requiring HOA board training, creating easier paths for homeowner recalls, and strengthening protections against selective enforcement. The work was time-consuming and sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply rewarding. Every time we helped someone successfully fight back against an abusive HOA, it felt like a small victory for justice. Brenda Whitmore, for her part, mostly disappeared from public view after being voted out. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had become increasingly isolated, with few friends and a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. Part of me felt sorry for her. She had spent so much energy on petty power plays that she had neglected actual human connections. But mostly, I just felt relieved that she couldn't hurt anyone else. The Stevens family became good friends of mine. Richard recovered fully from his heart attack and became an active member of the community, organizing veterans events and mentoring younger vets. He and Max developed a close relationship, bonded by their shared military experience and their shared experience being targeted by the HOA. Emma and Jake had a baby girl, and the whole neighborhood celebrated. It was a far cry from the divided, fearful community that had existed under Brenda's leadership. People looked out for each other now. They actually talked to their neighbors instead of just filing violation reports. Susan Kellerman was eventually elected as the permanent HOA president, and she ran the board with transparency and fairness. She instituted regular town halls where homeowners could voice concerns, created a clearer process for requesting exceptions to rules, and made sure enforcement was consistent and proportionate. The neighborhood thrived under her leadership. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm struck by how a simple act of family loyalty turned into something that touched so many lives. I never set out to be an activist or a reformer. I just wanted to help my brother when he needed me most. But sometimes standing up for one person means standing up for a principle. And standing up for a principle means creating change that ripples outward in ways you never anticipated. Max is doing great now. He's been in a relationship for several months with a woman he met through the veteran support group. He still has hard days. Sometimes PTSD doesn't just disappear, but he has tools to manage it and a support system that understands. He's not defined by his struggles anymore. He's just Max, living his life, moving forward. As for me, I'm still in the same house in Meadowbrook Heights. The neighborhood has become what I hoped it would be when I first moved in. A real community where people care about each other, where diversity is valued, and where rules serve people rather than the other way around. I keep Brenda's original violation notice framed on the wall in my home office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that injustice often comes dressed in bureaucratic language and claims of following procedure. A reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept injustice, even when accepting it would be easier. A reminder that standing up for what's right doesn't require you to be special or extraordinary. It just requires you to care enough to try. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. We often think of heroes as people who do remarkable things in extraordinary circumstances. But sometimes heroism is just refusing to let someone you love be treated unfairly. Sometimes it's pushing back against petty tyrants who hide behind rules. Sometimes it's believing that one person standing up can actually make a difference. It turns out, sometimes they can. The work continues. The Homeowners' Rights Coalition is helping people in 15 states now, and we're expanding. We've successfully supported legislation in 3 states that strengthens homeowner protections against HOA overreach. We've trained hundreds of homeowners on their rights and connected dozens with legal representation. Max is on the board of directors, using his experience to guide our advocacy work. He speaks at events sometimes, sharing his story and explaining why HOA reform matters. He's become a powerful voice for veterans' rights, and I couldn't be prouder. We get criticism sometimes from HOA industry groups who claim we're anti-community or that we encourage lawlessness. But that's not what this is about. Good HOAs serve their communities, maintain property values, and create pleasant places to live. We support that. What we oppose is abuse of power, selective enforcement, and discrimination hiding behind bylaws. Every person has the right to feel safe and secure in their own home. That's not radical or controversial, it's fundamental. And when an HOA threatens that security, whether through harassment, discrimination, or simple abuse of power, people have the right to fight back. That's what this story is really about. Not HOA drama or Karen memes or even military discrimination, though those are all part of it. It's about the fundamental human right to dignity, to be treated fairly, to have your home be a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. I think about that morning when Brenda first showed up on my porch, clipboard in hand, ready to flex her authority. I think about how close I came to just giving in, to telling Max he had to leave, to avoiding the whole messy conflict. It would have been so much easier. but it also would have been wrong. And sometimes the right choice is the hard choice, and you just have to accept that and move forward. So that's what we did. We moved forward. We fought back. We won. And now we're helping others do the same, because at the end of the day, home should mean something. It should be more than just property governed by bylaws and managed by boards. It should be a place where you can be yourself, where your family can find refuge, where life can happen without constant scrutiny and judgment. That's worth fighting for. That's worth all the stress and conflict and expense. That's worth everything. Max told me once, several months after he moved out, that the whole experience had taught him something important. He said that in Afghanistan, the fight was clear. There was an enemy, a mission, a defined purpose. But back home, the fights were murkier. The enemies weren't wearing uniforms. The missions weren't handed down from command. You had to decide for yourself what was worth fighting for and how far you were willing to go. But the principle is the same, he said. You fight for the people beside you. You fight to protect what matters. You don't abandon your post just because things get hard. He was right. And in a weird way, dealing with Brenda and the HOA had reminded both of us what we were made of. It had shown us that courage doesn't require combat boots and body armor. Sometimes it just requires showing up and refusing to back down. The story could have ended differently. Max could have left. I could have given up. Brenda could have won. But that's not what happened, and I'm grateful for that every single day. Instead, a community transformed. A brother healed. A movement started. And countless others found the courage to fight their own battles because they saw that winning was possible. That's the real victory. Not just what we achieved for ourselves, but what we made possible for others. And it all started because I refused to let my brother be treated as less than he deserved simply because he had served his country and was struggling with the aftermath. It started because family mattered more than peace and quiet. It started because right mattered more than easy. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone willing to stand up and say no more. Someone willing to fight when fighting seems pointless. Someone willing to believe that things can change. They can change. We proved it. And we'll keep proving it, one case at a time, one HOA at a time, until every homeowner knows their rights and every board understands that power comes with responsibility. That's the promise I made to myself when this all began, and it's a promise I intend to keep. For Max, for the Stevens family, for every veteran and person with a disability who has been discriminated against by an HOA, for everyone who has ever felt powerless against bureaucratic tyranny. This is our fight, and we're winning.